There's a specific kind of silence that falls over a room when someone walks in who doesn't belong, or at least who everyone thinks doesn't belong. It isn't loud. It isn't rude. It's the silence of assumptions being made at the speed of a glance. A half-second judgment. A flicker of a smirk. A straightened back that says, without words, you're in the wrong place. Most people never learn how expensive that silence can be. This is a story about the day a soldier learned. The morning started the way most mornings at Fort Hargrove started. Gray sky, cold concrete, the smell of diesel and bad coffee threading through the air like something that had given up trying to leave. The base was alive at 0530. It was always alive at 0530. Boots on pavement. Radio static bleeding through open doors. The kind of disciplined noise that says a machine is running, even if the people inside haven't fully woken up yet. Colonel Mara Voss walked through the main gate the way she walked everywhere, without announcement, without performance, without the invisible flag most high-ranking officers seemed to carry above their heads. She was 41 years old, lean in the way that long-distance runners are lean, with the kind of posture that isn't taught in boot camp but is worn to the spine by years of carrying weight other people don't see. Her hair was pulled back. Her uniform was clean, but not pressed to a crease. She looked, to anyone who didn't know better, like a logistics officer. Maybe a medical liaison. Someone administrative. Someone middle tier. She was not those things. She was the commanding officer of the 7th Special Operations Detachment, a unit so quietly effective that most people inside the military had only heard of it in the way you hear about weather systems in other countries. You know it exists. You've never stood in it. She carried a single folder under her left arm. She was not in a hurry. She was thinking about the briefing she had in 40 minutes, running numbers in her head the way she always did before she walked into a room where decisions would be made. Not because she was nervous, but because she liked to have already won the argument before it started. She was 6 steps from the entrance to Building C when she felt the hand. It wasn't a gentle redirect. It wasn't an "excuse me, ma'am, can I help you?" It was a shove, the flat-handed kind, open palm to the shoulder, the way you'd move someone who had wandered into a restricted corridor without clearance. Firm, dismissive, the physical language of, "you don't belong here" move. She stopped, not because the shove hurt. It didn't. She stopped because of what came with it. Hey. The voice belonged to Specialist Dale Brennan, 23 years old, 18 months stationed at Fort Hargrove, currently assigned to entrance security for Building C. He was, by all accounts, a competent young soldier. He was also, in this moment, doing something that was going to follow him for a very long time. This is a restricted building. You can't just walk in. Where's your badge? Mara turned around slowly. Brennan was already looking past her, already scanning the courtyard for the next person who needed redirecting. The hand that had shoved her was now held loosely at his side, casual, like the whole thing was already resolved. "Badge," he said again, eyes coming back to her, and this time there was a flicker, not recognition exactly, but something, a hesitation. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. It wasn't anger. It wasn't embarrassment. It was the expression of someone who has just decided to let a situation breathe before they respond to it. "I don't have my badge on me this morning," Mara said. Her voice was even, conversational, the voice of someone having a very ordinary exchange. "Then, you need to wait at the side entrance and request escort access. Standard protocol." He gestured toward a booth maybe 20 meters away. "Someone will come and verify you." "All right," she said. She walked to the booth. She waited. What happened in the next 12 minutes would be, in any objective retelling, a masterclass in how rank reveals itself when it chooses to, rather than when it's performed. The private at the verification booth was a young woman named Santos, 19, newer than Brennan, clearly running on her first cup of coffee and hoping the morning stay boring. She asked for name and unit. Mara gave both. Santos typed it into the system. Santos looked at the screen. Santos looked up at Mara. Santos looked back at the screen with the specific expression of someone whose stomach has just dropped through the floor. "Colonel Voss," Santos said. "That's right. Of the 7th SOD. Correct." Santos reached for the radio immediately. The radio call went up the chain in under 90 seconds, the kind of speed that only happens when someone realizes that a problem exists and wants to not be the last person holding it. By the time Brennan understood what was happening, the information had already moved 2 levels above him. The officer who came out to meet Mara at the side entrance was Captain Gerald Foss, Building C's floor officer for the morning. He was the color of a man who has received news that he cannot change, but wishes he could unreceive. He was walking fast, but try not to look like he was walking fast. He was not succeeding. Colonel Voss said, arriving slightly breathless. I'm so sorry for the delay at the entrance. There was a don't, Mara said. He stopped. Walk me inside, she said. We have a briefing. Voss walked her inside. Brennan watched this happen from his post. He watched the door to Building C open and close behind them. He stood very still for a moment after. The morning kept moving around him, boots radio static, the smell of diesel, and bad coffee, but inside his chest something had shifted. The way a loose bolt shifts when it realizes it is the thing holding everything together. He didn't know yet what it would cost him. Inside Building C, in a room on the second floor with no windows and too much artificial light, Colonel Mara Voss set her folder on the table and looked at the men and women waiting for her. There were 11 of them. Captains, mostly. One major. All of them from different units. Brought here for a joint operational briefing on a counterterrorism initiative that had been 18 months in the planning. All of them, in some version of their minds, had built a picture of who would be leading this briefing. The picture most of them had built looked nothing like the woman who had just walked in. She let them sit with that for exactly 5 seconds. Then, she opened the folder. We have 40 minutes, she said. I'll use 38 of them. You'll use 2. Let's begin. The room shifted. Not physically. The way rooms shift when they recalibrate around a person. When the initial assumption dissolves, and what's underneath, it becomes visible. Competence, clarity, the particular gravity of someone who does not need you to believe in them in order to operate at full capacity. She walked them through the initiative without notes. She had memorized it. Not because she needed to perform memorization, but because she had built it piece by piece over the better part of 2 years, and it lived in her the way things live in you when you've carried them long enough. She knew the terrain. She knew the personnel gaps. She knew which of the 3 proposed insertion points had a drainage problem that would compromise the timeline by 6 hours if it rained in the 48 hours prior. A detail that was in no report anyone in that room had read. When she was done, the major, a man named Petrov who had been skeptical in the precise and visible way that some men are skeptical of women who outrank them, said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, the drainage analysis on insertion point B. Where is that sourced? For me, she said. I walked that ground 2 years ago. Petrov looked at her. Something moved across his face that wasn't skepticism anymore. All right, he said. All right. That was all. But in the room, in the particular language of people who do not say more than they need to, it meant something larger. It meant I was wrong about what I thought I was walking into. It meant I will not make that mistake again. Downstairs, at the entrance to Building C, Brennan was still at his post. He had approximately 4 more hours left in his shift. He spent those hours doing his job with the careful attention of someone who has realized that attention is not something to be rationed based on appearances. He didn't know yet that 2 floors up, in a room with no windows, the woman he had shoved was restructuring a counterterrorism initiative that would, over the next 14 months, directly result in the dismantling of a logistics network that had been operating across 3 countries. He didn't know about the 3 field operatives who would come home because of the adjustment she made in the drainage analysis. The 6-hour shift that protected a window, that protected a team, that protected 3 lives. He knew only what he felt standing at that post. And what he felt was this. The cost of a half-second assumption is not always immediate. Sometimes it sits quiet. Sometimes it waits in your chest like a loose bolt, rattling slightly every time you move, reminding you that something isn't as tight as it needs to be. The morning kept going. Gray sky, cold concrete, diesel, and bad coffee. The machine running. Somewhere above him, Mara Voss closed her folder, stood up, and moved toward the next thing she needed to do. Unhurried, unshaken, carrying as she always had, the particular weight of someone whose authority lives in what they've done, not what they've announced. The door at the top of the stairs opened and closed. Below it, Brennan stood at his post. He straightened slightly without knowing why. Some things teach themselves. Word travels in a military base the way water travels through old pipes, quietly at first, then everywhere at once, and by the time you hear it you can't tell exactly where it started. By midday, Specialist Dale Brennan knew 3 things that he hadn't known at 0530. He knew that the woman he had shoved at the entrance to Building C was a colonel. He knew she commanded the 7th Special Operations Detachment. And he knew, with the particular certainty of someone receiving information through the social channels of a small, sealed community, that she had not filed a report. That last piece of information was somehow the most unsettling. An official complaint he could understand. An official complaint had shape. There were steps, a process, a known outcome at the end of a known road. You stood before someone. You answered questions. You accepted a consequence, and then you moved forward with a map of what you'd done marked clearly in your record. There was almost a relief in that, the cleanness of it. But no report meant something else entirely. It meant the morning was still open. It meant the story wasn't finished. And in the gap between what had happened and what would happen, Brennan's imagination started doing the thing imaginations do in silence, filling the space with worst-case architecture. He ate lunch alone that day, not because anyone excluded him, because he needed the quiet. Sergeant Marcus Webb sat down across from him halfway through the meal, uninvited and unbothered, the way Webb always did everything. Webb was 34, 11 years in, a man who had long ago metabolized the kind of experience that made younger soldiers nervous around him. He had a face like a compressed week, tired but functional, lived in, with a dry intelligence in his eyes that noticed most things and commented on fewer of them. He looked at Brennan's tray for a moment. "You're not eating," Webb said. "I'm eating." "You're pushing things around." Brennan put his fork down. "You heard." "I heard," Webb said. He didn't elaborate on that. He reached across and stole a bread roll from Brennan's tray with the unself-conscious ease of someone who had decided the conversation needed a beat of normalcy to function. He bit into it. Chewed. "You know who she is?" "I know now." "Not what her rank is," Webb said. "Who she is." Brennan looked up. Webb leaned back slightly, the bread roll held loosely in one hand, and for a moment he had the look of someone deciding how much to give. It wasn't a dramatic pause. It was the pause of a man who had learned to measure what he said because he understood the weight of information on an uninformed mind. "Her unit ran a 3-country operation 2 years ago," Webb said. "Joint effort. Classified at 3 levels above what you and are ever going to see. What leaked out, which wasn't much, was enough. 14 operatives. 11 objectives. 11 for 11. He paused. 11 for 11. The number landed the way Webb had intended it to. "She built that unit," Webb continued. "Took it over when it was half functional and losing people on operations it should have been winning. Spent 8 months restructuring the intel pipeline before she ran a single field op. Because she said, and this is the part that got around, she said you don't fix losses by running faster. You fix them by understanding what you're running toward." Brennan was quiet. "She's been here before," Webb said. 3 years ago. Different building, different purpose. You know why she didn't have her badge this morning?" "She said she didn't have it on her. She left it in her other jacket," Webb said, "which is at her apartment off base. Which she came from this morning after spending the night there, because she drove back from a 12-hour operational consultation at 0200 and didn't want to take the 45-minute drive back to base housing on no sleep." He finished the bread roll. "She's been on rotation for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of 12-hour days, 2 of those days being 20-hour days, one of them being a straight-through with no sleep at all." Brennan looked at his tray. "She wasn't trying to sneak into a restricted building," Webb said, his voice carrying no particular judgment, just the weight of facts settling into their correct positions. "She was a senior officer walking into a building she has every right to walk into on a morning when she was operating on 3 hours of sleep after 6 weeks of work that you and I will never fully see." The cafeteria moved around them. Trays and voices and the institutional clatter of a shared meal operating at scale. "She didn't file anything," Brennan said. "No, why not?" Webb looked at him for a moment. Then, he said, "Because she didn't need to." What nobody told Brennan, what he had to understand on his own over the days that followed, was that the absence of a formal complaint was not mercy. It wasn't oversight. It wasn't indifference. It was something more deliberate than any of those things, and it would take him longer than he expected to fully recognize it for what it was. Colonel Voss had spent 2 decades in a profession where the instinct to prove yourself is both necessary and ultimately exhausting. She had walked into rooms where she was underestimated more times than she had bothered to count. She had been handed smaller chairs than she deserved at more tables than any record would show. She had learned, through the specific curriculum of being a woman in a space that had been designed around the assumption of her absence, how to carry her authority in a way that didn't depend on external validation. She didn't file the report because she didn't need the system to tell him he was wrong. The morning had already done that. The moment Santos had looked up from the screen with her stomach dropping through the floor, that was the report. The moment Captain Foss had walked out to the side entrance with the color drained from his face, that was the correction. The moment 11 officers in a room with no windows had recalibrated their assumption in real time, that was the consequence. The system is slow. The truth is fast. She had learned to trust the faster one. 3 days after the incident at the entrance, Brennan was reassigned to a different post for the morning. Inner corridor, second floor, building C. It was not unusual. Rotation happened. But the specific post at the specific time meant that at 0720 he was standing in the hallway outside a conference room when the door opened and Colonel Voss walked out. She was mid-conversation with Captain Foss, who was walking slightly behind her in the way subordinates walk behind people they've recently been reminded to respect. She had a coffee in one hand and a phone in the other. She was saying something about a timeline adjustment. 3 words in, crisp, the sentence already half-built before she cleared the doorframe. She saw Brennan. He stood straight. He was already at attention in the way a person goes to attention when they've been rehearsing what they'd do if this exact moment happened, and the moment has now arrived. She stopped. Foss stopped behind her. The hallway was quiet. Mara looked at Brennan for a long moment. Not unkindly, not coldly. The way you look at something that requires a decision. She had not forgotten him. He could see that. He had not hoped she had. Specialist, she said. Mom. His voice was even. Barely. What's your name? Brennan, Mom. Dale Brennan. She nodded once. Not the nod of satisfaction. Not the nod of forgiveness. The nod of a woman filing information. Brennan, she said, when you go home tonight, I want you to think about something. He waited. Think about what you decided in the half-second before you put your hand on my shoulder, she said. Not what the protocol said. What you decided. What you saw. And what you concluded from it. Sit with that. A pause. That's all. She walked past him. Foss followed. The hallway was quiet again. Brennan stood at his post for the remaining 4 hours of his shift. He didn't push anything around at lunch. He ate everything on his tray and didn't taste any of it because his mind was somewhere else entirely, sitting in the place she had told him to sit, looking at the half-second, looking at what was in it. What was in it, when he looked honestly, was not malice. He had not looked at Mara Voss and thought something ugly. What was in it was simpler and, in some ways, harder to reconcile with. He had looked at her and made a map of who she was from the outside of her, and he had acted from that map with full confidence that the map was accurate. It wasn't. The map had been built from shortcuts, from the silhouettes of other people's assumptions stacked up and inherited until they felt like his own. He had not invented the idea that a woman walking into a restricted building without a visible badge, in practical clothes, without press creases, was probably not someone who commanded one of the most effective special operations units in the country. That idea had been offered to him by 1,000 small moments. Images, jokes, offhand comments, the shape of things he'd absorbed without questioning because they'd been in the air since before he was old enough to breathe with intention. The map was wrong. That was the thing he sat with that night. Not what he'd done, what he'd been working from. 2 weeks after the corridor, a development occurred that nobody at Fort Hargrove had fully anticipated. The joint operational initiative that Mara's briefing had shaped, the one restructured around the drainage analysis correction, the one that moved insertion point B's timeline, was flagged for an early green light. The 18-month planning horizon compressed. The intelligence window that the timeline adjustment had created was opening faster than projected. This meant the 7th SOD was going active. It meant Mara Voss, who had spent 6 weeks in consultation and briefing and the 1,000 invisible forms of preparation that never make it into any official account, was now shifting into a different gear. The administrative layer fell away. The part of her work that happened in rooms with too much artificial light was closing. The part that happened in places without names was opening. The day before the unit moved out, she did 2 things that were not required of her by any protocol and that were entirely consistent with who she was. The first was a 20-minute meeting with the families of 3 younger operatives who were joining a full operation for the first time. Not a briefing, not a formality. She sat with them in a small room and let them ask the questions they were afraid to ask and answered the ones she was able to answer and was honest without cruelty and without false comfort about the ones she couldn't. She had done this every time, for every operation, since the 3rd year of her command. Nobody had asked her to start. Nobody could have asked her to stop. The second was a note. It was handwritten, 3 sentences. It arrived at the desk of Specialist Dale Brennan via internal mail with no cover sheet and no explanation. His name on the envelope. No rank designation, just the name. Inside, the protocol was correct. Your instincts need calibration, not punishment. Punishment doesn't reach the instinct. Do the work of the question I gave you. That's the whole job. No signature. No rank indicator. He didn't need either. He read it twice, folded it once, put it in his left breast pocket, and kept it there for a long time, through the remainder of his posting at Fort Hargrove, through the transfer that came 8 months later, through the beginning of a career that would, over the following decade, develop a reputation for a particular quality that his colleagues found unusual and somewhat hard to name. The quality was this: Brennan never assumed from the outside. He always looked for the second read, the context below the surface, the thing that the map was missing. He became, over time, the kind of soldier who was given complicated situations because he had a talent for seeing what was actually in them. Not what they appear to contain, not what instinct assembled from shortcut and inherited assumption, but what was genuinely, specifically, demonstrably there. He never told anyone about the note. Some corrections are private. The 7th SOD moved out on a Tuesday. The base was the same: gray sky, cold concrete, diesel, and bad coffee. The machine running. The particular noise of a place that operates regardless of what any individual inside it is carrying. Mara Voss walked through the main gate at 0445 that morning. She had her badge. She had slept 4 hours. She was thinking about terrain, about the drainage analysis, about the specific weight of responsibility that sits in your chest, not because it's heavy, but because it's yours and you've chosen it clearly, and you carry it the way you'd carry anything you'd chosen clearly, without complaint and without theater. She walked through the gate. No one stopped her. The gate guard, a young corporal she didn't know, looked up as she passed. He made eye contact. He nodded. She nodded back. That was all. The morning kept moving. The operation had no official name that would ever appear in any document that could be freely requested. Inside the 7th SOD, the team called it Coldwater. Not because anyone had designated it that, but because Mara had once described the intelligence gap at its center as jumping into cold water in the dark, and the phrase had attached itself to the planning the way certain phrases do when they're precisely accurate. It stuck. It traveled through the unit in the shorthand of people who are too busy and too focused to waste words, and by the time they were 3 weeks into active staging, Coldwater was simply the name of the thing everyone was moving toward. 14 operatives, 2 support specialists operating from a forward position 40 kilometers from the primary objective, 1 intelligence analyst, a woman named Ree, 36 years old, with a flat effect and a photographic memory, and the specific gift of seeing pattern and noise, who had been embedded with the unit for 11 months and had become, in Mara's assessment, the most important person in any room she walked into. The objective, simplified to its essential shape, was this: a logistics chain that had been supplying material to 3 separate networks across 2 continents had a single administrative node. Not a physical target, not a warehouse or a compound. A person, a coordinator who had spent 4 years building redundancy into every layer of the supply chain except the one layer that could not be made redundant, which was his own access codes, his own memory, his own unique knowledge of how the financial routing worked. Cut that node, and the chain didn't just pause. It had to be rebuilt from scratch by people who didn't fully understand what they were rebuilding, which meant a minimum of 14 months of operational disruption. 14 months during which 3 active threat vectors would be running on improvisation instead of infrastructure. 14 months was enough. Getting to the node was the problem. The coordinator, referred to in all planning documents as Subject Red, though Ree had privately nicknamed him the accountant in a tone that was not entirely without contempt, moved. He was not in the same city for more than 9 days. He had 5 travel patterns that overlapped in ways designed to make surveillance modeling expensive. He had, by all indications, a working understanding of how tracking operations functioned, which meant he adjusted his patterns at intervals that were slightly longer than operational cycles, but slightly shorter than the time needed to set up clean coverage. He was, in the particular way of very careful people, almost invisible. Almost. Rhea had found the gap 3 months before they moved. It was in the 14-day window that occurred every 11 weeks when 2 of his travel patterns overlapped in a city that had. And this was the detail that mattered, a specific drainage infrastructure problem in the district where his confirmed associate maintained an office. A problem that, combined with the weather pattern typical to that region in that month, produced a predictable flooding event in a 3-block radius. A flooding event that forced street-level rerouting, which meant a specific 3-hour window when his movement options compressed from 11 possible routes to 4. 4 routes. 14 operatives. 1 window every 11 weeks. Rhea had brought this to Mara's attention on a Tuesday afternoon, standing at a wall-length map with a coffee she hadn't touched, pointing at a drainage diagram with a pencil, and saying in a flat tone she reserved for things she was completely certain about. This is it. This is the only time it's ever going to look like this. Mara had looked at the drainage diagram for 11 seconds. Write it up, she said. It's already written up. Of course it was. The operation moved into its active phase on a night with a low cloud cover that flattened the stars and pressed the darkness close to the ground. The team moved in 3 units, not because the objective required that exact geometry, but because the city's layout and the compressed routing window made 3 a more recoverable number than 2 if something went wrong on any single approach. Mara was with the 3rd unit. She was always with the 3rd unit, the one that moved last, that held position longest, that operated with the most information because it had the most time to receive it. This was not caution. This was architecture. The 3rd unit was her eyes on the whole shape of the operation. She needed to be where she could see the most, not where she could act first. Unit 1 moved at 21:47. Unit 2 at 22:04. Unit 3, Mara, 2 operators named Castillo and Pell, and Rhea in the support position on a rooftop 40 meters from the primary approach, moved at 22:31. The flooding was exactly where Rhea said it would be. The routing compression was exactly what the drainage diagram had predicted. Subject Red, the accountant, the coordinator of a logistics chain that had been running for 4 years across 3 countries, appeared on the 4th route at 2,249, 14 minutes earlier than the median projection, 2 minutes inside the outer edge of the window. He was wearing a gray coat. He was carrying an umbrella he wasn't using because the rain had stopped 40 minutes earlier. He was looking at his phone with the slightly distracted attention of a man who does not believe himself to be in any particular danger. Unit 1 confirmed visual at 22:51. What happened in the next 19 minutes is not something that appears in any document accessible at a general clearance level. What appears in the eventual summary, the version that moves upward through channels, the version that lands on desks and offices that have better coffee and cleaner windows than any room Mara Voss worked in, is a single line of operational outcome language. Subject read, secured. Access codes retrieved. Chain intelligence, complete. 19 minutes. For years of planning and running and careful, deliberate invisibility, and then 19 minutes in a flooding city with compressed routes and a team that had been built to do exactly this. The team reassembled at the forward position at 0112. Mara did a head count in the particular way she always did head counts. Not quickly, not as a formality, but completely, looking at each face for the 4 seconds it took to be certain of what she was seeing. 14. 2 support. Everyone. She had never lost anyone on an operation. She was aware in the specific and not superstitious way of someone who has thought about probability at length that this record would not hold forever. She was also aware that the reason it had held as long as it had was not luck. It was the drainage analysis, the 11-second decisions, the 14 months of building the intelligence pipeline before running the first op. It was Rhee's flat effect and her pencil and her untouched coffee and her certainty. It was Castillo's habit of triple-checking the secondary exit on every approach and Pell's ability to hold a position for 40 minutes in uncomfortable conditions without his attention drifting by a single degree. It was the work. Good work, Mara said. In the vocabulary of the 7th SOD, this was the equivalent of a standing ovation. 6 hours after the operation closed, In the gray early morning of a city that had no idea what had happened in its flooding streets the night before, Mara Voss sat in a forward staging room with a cup of coffee that was better than Fort Hargrove coffee, but not by much, and wrote the operational summary with the same careful economy she brought to everything. She wrote it in the language of the documents, clean, depersonalized, outcome-focused, but she wrote every word herself. She had been offered administrative support for this kind of writing many times and had always declined. She wrote it herself because the people in the operations deserved to have someone who was actually there tell the story of what they'd done. She filed it at 0603. At 0604, she closed her laptop and sat for a moment in the staging room with the finished coffee and the quiet that comes after something large has concluded. It was not a triumphant quiet. It was the quiet of a task completed and a weight set down, which is different from triumph and more sustainable than it. She thought, briefly and without full intention, about the entrance to Building C. The morning 6 weeks ago, the hand on her shoulder, the young soldier's face when he'd understood what the screen was showing. She thought about the note she'd written him. Do the work of the question I gave you. That's the whole job. It was true for him. It was true for her. It was true for everyone in the forward staging room, sleeping on inadequate cots in the thin, early morning of an operation that had just removed 14 months of infrastructure from a logistics chain that had been killing people at a remove, the distant, invisible accountant's kind of killing, the kind that never shows up in any casualty count because the paperwork is too clean. Do the work of the question. The question for Brennan was, what was I working from? The question she asked herself every time before every operation was different. Her question was, what am I not seeing? The drainage, the routing compression, the 11-second look at Ree's diagram, the adjustment to insertion point B that had protected a window, that had protected a team, that had protected 3 lives, that operation 2 years before this one that Brennan didn't know about, that most people who use the word elite in casual conversation didn't know about. What am I not seeing? It was never a comfortable question. It was never meant to be. The comfort in it was not the comfort of an answer, but the comfort of a practice, the knowledge that asking it was the thing that made the difference, not finding a final, permanent answer that could be filed and closed. The question stayed open. That was the point. Back at Fort Hargrove, in the weeks following the operation's conclusion, something happened that was not dramatic and was not announced and was in the way of most real change, almost invisible to anyone watching for visible things. The entrance protocol for Building C was reviewed. Not because of a formal complaint, there was still none on record, but because Captain Foss, who had spent the weeks since the incident in a kind of low-grade professional discomfort that had proven more educational than any formal review board, had requested a protocol assessment on his own initiative. He framed it as a routine efficiency audit. It was not a routine efficiency audit. The assessment identified 3 gaps in the entrance verification process. Gaps that had nothing to do with Brennan specifically and everything to do with a system that had been designed around a certain set of assumptions about what a senior officer looked like when arriving at a facility. The gaps were closed. The process was adjusted. The training for entrance security was updated with a module that, in its official language, addressed recognition errors in non-standard presentation scenarios. What it was actually about, stripped to its structure, was this: a system had been built around an assumption, and the assumption had been wrong, and instead of punishing the person who had acted on the assumption, the system had examined itself. This was rarer than it should have been. Foss never told anyone what had prompted the assessment. He didn't need to. The people who understood what had happened understood. The people who didn't understand would benefit from the change without needing to understand where it came from. That was fine. That was how most useful change moved through institutions. Not as a declared revolution, but as a quiet adjustment, a recalibration, a protocol update, and a training module that nobody celebrated, but that functioned from that day forward to produce slightly better results than the system had produced before. The machine, adjusted, kept running. Brennan received his transfer orders 8 months after the morning at the entrance. He was in a different posting. Larger base, higher operational tempo, more complex environment. It was by any standard measure a step forward. He had been assessed as ready. He had been assessed, specifically, as having unusual contextual judgment for his experience level, a phrase that appeared in his review and that his reviewing officer had not elaborated on, as though the phrase contained its own complete explanation. The night before he left Fort Hargrove, he went through the small ritual of packing that forces you to handle every object you've been living with and decide which ones travel with you. Most things were routine. The folded note in his left breast pocket was not. He read a final time. The protocol was correct. Your instincts need calibration, not punishment. Punishment doesn't reach the instinct. Do the work of the question I gave you. That's the whole job. He folded it back. He packed it. At his new posting, in the months that followed, he would find himself in situations that required the specific quality the note had pointed him toward. Moments where the surface of a thing said one thing and the depth of it said another, where the map built from shortcuts led to the wrong door and the second red led to the right one. He made the call correctly more often than his experience level would have predicted. His colleagues noticed. He became someone who was asked, when a situation was ambiguous, what he thought was actually going on. He was never entirely certain, in those moments, whether what he was doing was talent or practice. He suspected it was practice that had been made necessary by a specific morning. A gray sky, cold concrete, a folder under a woman's arm, and the cost of a half-second assumption that a patient, unhurried person had turned into a question instead of a punishment. He suspected that this was the most useful thing that had ever happened to him. He was right, but he would have been wrong to call it luck.